guy you talk about around the water cooler. That's why I'm standing next to a water cooler. I mean, I used him on the show because he had an innate sense of what would work and what wouldn't work. He always had a good ear for what joke was appropriate and what was really funny. And he always had a good eye for a bit. You know, there are guys that can write stuff and it's off the wall, completely inappropriate, but Gabe always kind of knew exactly what would work on the show, and that's why we were successful when he was there.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another 80s golden age of comedy. I am excited to have on my guest today because I really don't know too much about Gabe. I don't know if he's too young to have been solidly in the 80s, but I got to tell you that a lot of people I've spoken to said, "Did you get Gabe on the show yet? Did you get Gabe on the show?" You said, "Well, no, I don't really know Gabe." Well, you know what? He's accessible. He's a brilliant guy. He's so funny. And I said, let me go after Gabe Abelson because it should be a lot of fun. Number one, to have someone on the show that I don't know at all, not that people don't know of him, but to have someone with this incredible, rich background. I mean, talk about someone that has 5 Emmy nominations for brilliance in writing, and not just on some unknown shows, but we're talking about Letterman, we're talking about Tonight Show with Jay Leno, and it just goes on and on from there. So I don't want to hear myself talk anymore because I want to hear Gabe. Gabe, welcome to the show. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I liked hearing you talk because it was all good stuff about me. I can't say that stuff. So I enjoyed every second of that.
Exactly. So
good to see you, Bruce. Great to be here. Thanks.
And we've talked about this for a few weeks, and sometimes when it takes a few weeks to get the dates in, it makes it even more appetizing. So I'm looking forward to this time with you. You know, I love finding out first about, and when I say little Gabe, it's not a put down at all. It's, where did Gabe come from?
Oh, it was definitely little Gabe. And I was also very pleased to hear you say, I don't know if he's old enough for the early 80s. I absolutely am. I passed auditions, and the timing is very interesting doing this today. I passed auditions. What changed my life was as soon as I graduated college, I studied acting with Lee Strasberg, founded Method Acting,
Wow.
But I always knew I wanted to be a comic since the time I was 14 and got my first Carlin album. So I went right to the comic strip in New York and auditioned and passed auditions. And the night I passed auditions is the night they were looking at Eddie Murphy for Saturday Night Live, like his final stage thing. So I passed, he got the show. So that was in 1980. So yes, I've been doing this since 1980.
Okay, so we can't gloss through someone's first 5 or 10 minutes because from what I hear, it takes, centuries to get that first gold 5, 7 minutes so that you can get passed on to that next level, go past go. So where did you grow up? And even before that, where did you grow up? But did your family life have anything at all to do with going into show business? And then I'm not going to gloss past when you were 14 and you decided to go into comedy. Wait, we got to talk all about that too.
Okay. So my family is everybody's family is interesting. My family is incredibly fascinating, their backstory. My mother was a Holocaust survivor. She had me very late in life. And as an only child, to have me at 41 at that time was very risky. My father was a philosophy professor emeritus at NYU for 50 years. And he was the dumb one in his family. No, I mean, they're mega brains. My uncle Lionel was the primary translator, only authorized translator for Jean-Paul Sartre, who created existentialism and founded that movement. And my uncle was also a theater critic and created a form of theater known as meta theater, where the actors within the play know who they are, know that they're characters. And so my daughter, who just went to college, they started, she was in theater history class. Anybody know what meta theater is? She raised her hand. Yeah, my uncle came up with that.
Wow.
Yeah, so I came from this family. So at first, when I went into comedy, I thought it's got to be something wrong with me. They're all professors, you know. But what was so interesting is I did stand up for 17 years before I got a late night writing job. When going back to your overnight success thing,
Oh my
and
God.
I found within late night, I had success within 2 years that I'd never achieved in 17 years of stand up because monologue writing is very different. I teach it. I have students in my class that are stand-ups for 15 years, and some of them just never, it's a different language. It's almost the opposite of stand-up. Stand-up is about who you are. You know what I hate? You know what scares me? Monologue is all about looking at topical stories and writing punchlines to them, and it's very structured. And I realized that's sort of what ties the most into what my dad did because he taught logic and just construction of these jokes and thinking of the logic behind them. Is a logic airtight. That was always a big thing with Letterman and Leno. I think that becoming a writer and now a teacher, by the way, you mentioned getting 5 minutes. I just started teaching, if I'm allowed to do a little plug here,
Absolutely.
Flappers Comedy Club in LA, which is great because now all their classes are on Zoom. I started teaching their advanced level 4 stand-up, which is getting your 5 minute set for TV ready. That's specifically
Wow.
veteran comics putting their 5 minutes together, their 5 minute auditions. And I already teach their writing for late night class. So if anybody's interested, you can go to Flappers Comedy Club. Flappers University is what it's called. They really do have a university, an entire building next door with all sorts of classes from screenwriting to sketch to late night monologue to stand up.
Wow.
And I teach privately as well. And I got to say, I have students on almost every talk show. The head writer, Jimmy Kimmel, Gary Greenberg was a student of mine back in the 80s, late 80s. So yeah, so it's been, you know, you reach different stages of your career. And now I'm at the stage where I'm really enjoying sort of passing on everything I've learned, not just what to do, but what definitely not to do, which is equally as important. And so that's kind of where I am right now. So yes, when I was 13, my whole life, or the first 40 years of my life, I grew up on 123rd Street between Broadway and Amsterdam in New York,
Wow.
White Harlem. What that was it was a block away from where George Carlin grew up. Now, I didn't know this. As a kid, when I was a little kid, there was this old white-haired woman who would sit on the bench downstairs in front of my building, and I would sit with her, and it was very weird because here I am, like 10 years old, and here's this ancient lady, but she was so entertaining, telling me stories of her son, George. What turned out it was Mary Carlin, George's mother.
Oh my God.
And so, you know, then I got the album, then I became, oh my God, I can't believe he lived here. And then, you know, and then over the years in stand-up, I'd never written a letter to a celebrity ever. And I'd worked with all his contemporaries. I'd worked with David Brenner and Robert Klein, never worked with Carlin. So I wrote him a letter. I got a P.O. box address for him, and I mentioned his mom, and I mentioned a couple of stories so he would know I wasn't just some crazy fan that only someone that knew his mom would know.
Wow.
And so 2 months later, I get a call. My wife comes running into my office. Oh my God, George Carlin's on the phone. Carlin called me, and we spent about 2 hours on the phone talking about the old neighborhood. And then finally, it sort of came full circle years later when I was in Letterman. He was on Letterman. We actually got a chance to meet then and talk.
Wow. I mean, the one guy that people bring up as someone that they tried to emulate was Carlin.
Absolutely. He and Pryor
Yes.
are, you know, and I think if I had to mention someone today that's doing sort of what they did, it would be Dave Chappelle.
Yes.
Because, you know, Carlin was amazingly funny. I mean, to me, and maybe it's because I was too young and it was a product of its time. Like, to me, I don't find Lenny Bruce super funny, but I do think he's probably the most important comic ever. Without him, there is no George Carlin or Richard Pryor or David Tell, Chris Rock, or Eddie Murphy. You know, he broke down those doors. He got arrested. He died for our sins, so to speak. You know, but Carlin was funny. I loved his early stuff, his really silly stuff. You know, then he got more and more political and more kind of angry. But I think the closest we have today to a comedy philosopher is Dave Chappelle, who reaches something higher than just comedy, where you're not going out, oh, I love that bit on, airline food or whatever. It's not going to be that. With Dave Attell, you're forced to examine your own prejudices, your own beliefs, preconceptions. And that's what Carlin did too. And Bill Hicks, the great ones, kind of hold a mirror up to society and make us realize, oh, wait a minute, that's kind of messed up that I think that way. So yeah.
And, no one is better at exposing what's going on in the world than comedians, and especially the ones you just mentioned.
Exactly. And what I find interesting about George Carlin, and I won't get into politics, but I do think it's very interesting to just show how universal it is, how you can be so opinionated and yet universal. Sometimes he'll say something and I'll see people on the left post the clip of Carlin, but sometimes Carlin will say something and I'll see only people on the right post what he said. So he's resonating, as opinionated as he is, he's resonating with both, which I think is really interesting and a very tough line to walk.
I never thought of that, but I think you're absolutely right. I don't think anyone kind of hated him, but that brings up, and I still want to go into the first 5 or 7 minutes.
Because he wasn't anti-Democrat, he wasn't anti-Republican, he was anti-government.
Yeah, and that brings up Bill Maher. Because,
who I wrote for, by the way.
I know exactly, but he doesn't have that.
I would disagree with that only because, number one, I wrote for.
And I loved his show.
Bill also has very extreme views, or he's very opinionated, I should say. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. It's good to have strong opinions.
Yes.
But because he's a, and I can't even think of the name for it, not independent. I can't believe the word for it is escaping me right now. But basically, some of his opinions are very liberal, but some of his opinions are very conservative. And so, no matter what it is, as a writer for him, here's how it worked. Most writers' room, there are like, 13 writers. When I was writing for him, there were only like 5 or 6 of us. And basically it was an argument over stories that were in the news. And Bill would finally say, well, let us know what his opinion was. And then we would have to write it up for that segment of the show. Each one of us was assigned like a certain topic. Now, sometimes I totally agreed with him. I was on the same page. It was easy to write, but sometimes I totally disagreed with it. So it's almost like in acting. If you play a horrible character, if you're playing a Hitler, whatever, someone awful, you have to find something in the character that you can identify with, because you can't just hate the character. You have to find something that you can understand or that you can relate to in order to believe what you're saying, in order to, so I would have to find something in that topic that Bill said that I totally disagreed with and make a convincing argument for it, which it's interesting. My daughter just started taking some law classes, and that's what you have to do there is they'll give you an argument and you'll have to argue for and against. So I think Bill kind of does walk that line. Yes, he leans more to the left, but occasionally he'll come out with something that's really, really far right. And so no matter what it is, far left, far right, you have to be able to write for it. So it's a challenge. It's a very challenging gig.
And it's good that he's not locked in. See, one of the things I don't like at all is when someone is so locked in that they can't even see anything new, any information new that would make them go, wait, I might need to rethink this.
Exactly.
And so I give him a lot of credit for that. So let's stick with Bill, because I didn't know Bill, but we certainly hung out in the same circles at the Improv, and he was there plenty of times. But I really haven't had anybody report what was it like to work with Bill behind the scenes. What was Bill Maher like? Not that he's Lenny Bruce, but what was Bill Maher like?
Well, really the only time I had much interaction with him was in the writer's room in the morning. So we would meet in the morning, discuss what the topics of the day were. We knew who the guests were, so we wrote questions for those specific guests, and everybody sort of took their assignment. And if we were doing the monologue was longer then, so every monologue is something that the one thing that's not written by committee. Everybody goes back to their office and writes monologue. So, that was pretty straightforward. The person that I really had the most FaceTime with, actually, I was the only one writer who had FaceTime with, was Dave, because Dave is very private. He's like Bill, too. I mean, Jay is much more visible at the show. Dave was very private, but the monologue was so important to him. It was just me and Dave and the cue card guy in Dave's dressing room every day for an hour going over the jokes. And that was my first job, my first real staff job in television, arguably my biggest to this day. And so it was thrilling. It was terrifying, so exciting to just be with Dave, going over and arguing over the jokes every day.
So you did that as the head writer.
Yes. What I would do is, it was unusual in that my predecessor at the show ended up making that department his own. So whereas all the other shows, every writer goes back to their office and writes monologue, at Late Show, it was just me. And I had about 13 faxers that would get $75 if they sold a joke, which is how I started. They would send in 20 jokes. If they sold one, they get $75 or whatever. So it was me and them and two guys we called the boys that wrote for Johnny Carson. They were his head writers for 20 years. And you know how Dave's affection for Johnny. And so between the faxers and the boys and me, I would get about 250, 300 jokes a day, out of which I would show Dave about 75.
Wow.
He would pick off the ones he liked, send me back the sheets, and I would give them to Tony, the cue card guy, put them on cue cards. We'd go to rehearsal. I would always find a few that I thought he should have picked, and I'd have Tony put those on cue cards, and then we'd go to rehearsal and argue over them. So that was fun. And sometimes we'd even bet on them. We would.
So tell us a little bit about Dave. You said he's a private guy.
Yeah.
What don't people know about Dave?
Well, one thing is he's in incredible shape. He's, when you see people in TV, and I'm sure you know this, you see them, you've only seen them on TV and you see them in person, you're shocked how skinny they look. Dave is, I think, about 6'3" or so, 6'3.5". He's 170 pounds.
Wow.
Now I'm 185 and I'm not fat,
Right.
So he's really thin. So he lost his own dad when his dad was in his mid 50s, very young, from heart attack. So Dave was a jogger, and he would jog miles and miles every day. And when he had a place in New York City, which he ended up giving up, he would jog up to the studio at 5 a.m. under the West Side Highway, where it was dark. He would have the baseball cap pulled down. It was dangerous, So when he needed his quintuple bypass, they said that he probably would not have made it, but he had the body of like a 25-year-old athlete. And I think he made sure to be in that kind of shape for many years because he saw what happened to his father. And of course, now, our medical knowledge is much greater, and he was hoping to, so they said he probably wouldn't have made it to that point if he hadn't been in that kind of shape. And I have to say, one of my most proud moments, although it was not my best joke, but most proud moments, was the night he came back after his heart surgery. Maybe you saw the show.
I think I might have.
He lined up his surgical team and he shook their hands one by one and thanked them. And I had a joke in the monologue that night that was printed across the first couple pages in the New York Post. So I still have the paper. It was very exciting. And a typical Dave joke. He says, when I found it out I need a quintuple bypass, my entire career flashed before my eyes. And honestly, it was mostly awkward silences. It's a very Dave joke. No one else could or would tell that joke. He was always the boob at the end of the day. And I think that's what made his sarcasm and his being a curmudgeon palatable, was that at the end of the day, the joke was on him. He was the boob. He was the idiot. And so it was a very clever way to portray himself, where he could be edgier and more acerbic and yet still stay really likable.
And one of the big reasons I like him so much is that we share the same birthday. We're both April 12th. Different year, but we're both April 12th.
My son is April 13th. You got it coming up. Cool.
Very nice. So, yeah. I mean, Dave was always, the people that know him from the very beginning years know him as a weatherman.
That's right. That's right.
And when he came back, when he went west and he left, I think the same state that Johnny Carson was in, he was a weatherman in the Midwest, and he came back. He went out to
west,
the West.
LA. And that whole group came up together, him and Leno,
Leno.
J.J. Walker. In fact,
Yeah,
Leno and Letterman used to write for J.J. Walker.
that's right. That's
Jimmy
the
Walker.
stories I hear. And the other story I hear is anytime someone said that Jay Leno and Letterman were like this, made up.
They were best friends. They were best friends. And in fact, if you watch the Comedy Store documentary, and as you know, after the fact, when Jay got the Tonight Show, there was no love lost really between Letterman and Jay, mostly on Dave's side. He was angry for not getting the show. Although I think it was the best thing that ever happened, because I think the Tonight Show would have been the Letterman show and he would have lost that audience that I think Leno managed to retain. And Dave did not lose his brand by sticking at CBS. He was able to stick with that brand. So I actually think it worked out for the best. But if you watch anything with Dave, like the new Comedy Store documentary, he says, Letterman says, Jay Leno is the only comedian in America I've never seen bomb, not once. Every other comedian at the store, he gives him his due every time they ask him about Leno as a comic. He said to Oprah, he said, hands down, Jay Leno is the strongest nightclub comedian in America. And if you see him live, he is. People that only know him from the Tonight Show, like Jay Leno is the strongest.
Killer.
Yes, he is.
He kills.
Yes.
And
Destroyed.
I actually know, from my point of view, having been a personal appearance agent in the 80s, I know that the reason is he worked every night.
Exactly.
He worked 320 days on the road, and whenever he was back, he worked the Comedy Store, got on his motorcycle with his leather jacket.
Comedy Magic Club in Hermosa Beach every Sunday.
And then the Improv, and then out to Hermosa.
Yep.
So you can bomb, but you can't when you're that practiced, when you're that tough, when you're that sharp. And that's a beautiful thing. I never heard it said like that before, but that's why, because I called him, and many others call him, the hardest working comedian in show business.
Do you know how exhausting it is to host a nightly talk show, an hour every night, and all the stuff you have to go over, the books of the guests you have to read, the movies, and then he would leave on the weekend to fly to the Mirage every weekend to do a set because he has a contract with the Mirage. That's somebody like Seinfeld who just has tunnel vision. I want to be a stand-up comic. The acting thing sort of just happened to Jerry. It's not something he ever sought out. He still doesn't seek it out. You notice he's not doing movies and, you know, maybe done a couple voiceovers here and there, but it's just not in his, it's not what he wants. He wants to be a stand-up. And the problem is, this is where stand-up started getting worse. When comics started getting development deals, like Jerry and so forth, comics suddenly saw the stand-up as a means to an end, the end being the sitcom.
Getting found. Yeah.
But that's a problem. You have to be in it. You know, I always say, what would you be doing that you're doing now for money, or anything that you would still do if you weren't making a penny? So, and if you weren't making a penny doing stand-up and you still say, I got to do it, I have to be on stage, that's what you are, a comic. You know, if you say stand-up is great, I do it when I can, but I'm an actor, well, you'll never be a great stand-up. You just won't. You know, and I tell people in my class, in some of the newer people I work with, I say, do you get up often? And they say, yeah, you know, at least once or twice a week. And I say, okay, imagine going to the gym once a week and trying to get buff and big twice a week. Not going to work. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be in that zone where you're so relaxed. What happens is, the more developed you get in stand-up, the more writing you start to do on stage, because you're not thinking about your act anymore. You're so in the moment, as they say in acting, even though it's a cliche. I mean, it's the best way to describe it. You're so in the moment, you know, and the adrenaline is flowing, the synapses are firing when you're on stage, that when you're so relaxed, you have no more stage fright and you're just in the moment. That's when you start coming up with taglines to your existing jokes on stage.
And then the thing that they bring up a lot in the 80s, which really makes it the golden age. Yes, the evening at the Improv and having that whole thing take off, which gave me my position as a personal appearance agent, and that's how that happened. But what really made the 80s golden age of the comedy was the camaraderie between the comedians.
100%. And I was just talking to somebody about that the other day. Like I said, in many ways, I feel like when I came out to LA when I was about 40, I feel like a virgin because all I knew from stand up was comics helping comics. I didn't get gigs even. My home club was a comic strip, which I just read is up for lease. And as you know, the owner, Richie Tenkin, passed about a month ago. And Richie was like a second father for me. And I posted on social media, I said, I've had a career now for 41 years in comedy that would not have been possible without Richie. And of all the people that ran that club, Richie was my biggest champion. And so it's still very, very difficult for me. I think about him all the time. And when I read yesterday that the comic strip is up for lease, it's like that's the last vestige, you know? It's like Patch disappeared, the Improv disappeared in New York. And yeah, we have Stand Up New York and the Cellar, but they came around later. The Strip's been there since 76, and the Strip was the last one. Even though it was the runt of the litter when there was the Improv Catch and the Strip suddenly became the place. And so it was very, very sad for me to see that happening. That was, every night, to talk about it often on stage. If I wasn't on the road, I was in there every night. And here's the difference. In 1980, 81, 82, if you went into the comic strip on a Tuesday or Wednesday night, middle of the week, the average lineup was Jerry Seinfeld, Larry Miller, Rita Rudner, Joe Bolster, Dennis Wolfberg, George Wallace, Louis Anderson, Sam Kinison. There was not a weak link in the bunch. And now, if you're at one of these glitzy Hollywood comedy clubs, if one of those people comes in on a Saturday, it's a huge deal. Back then, every night, it's because I could have named every comic in America in 1980. Now, I couldn't name, and I'm not exaggerating, I don't think I could name a 10th of the comics just in LA. But so the business completely changed. And I think even before comics saw it as a vehicle to get a sitcom, before that, once it broke big, 81, 82, and suddenly it really spread like a virus. Every comedy club in the country, every little town started having either a comedy club or a sports bar that had a comedy night. Now it became a thing where there was enough work for everyone. And people now, it's like they're just astounded the kind of money that we made back then that was all cash. And it was just, they flew in MCs to gigs. Now they don't fly in features or MCs. And if you're lucky, they fly in the headliner. Back then they were flying in the MC and the feature. It was a different time. And it was a very small community. But as soon as, because it was a good business, a really good lucrative business, and you could be on the road, there were people that probably never intended to be comics that thought, oh, well, I could go on stage and put a rubber schlong on my head and be an instant headliner. And that's what happened. And so it was sort of a simultaneously dumbing down of the comics, and the audience started to reflect each other. There were too many comics, and it became just an alternative. There was too much comedy. It used to be, you had to seek it out. It was only New York and LA, and it was sort of an underground thing. And hey, let's go see George Carlin, at the Village Gate or whatever. And that was all there was. But now that there was one in every town, it was no longer a novelty. It's like, hey, Joe, you want to go to movies? They're sold out. Okay, let's go see comedy. And now once it's an alternative, it loses everything that makes it magical and special. And so, so
and what's missing from that show is that sheer determination that we just talked about.
Yep.
That being up there every day, perfecting every word, having that 30, 45 minutes, getting that down, working every night if you could, and not being able to do anything else. And I'm hearing that that's the difference between everybody back then and the comedians that are coming up now. They don't have that sheer, unstoppable determination.
Yeah, I mean, I think some do.
Some do.
Absolutely,
Some
some
do.
do. And you know, for me, New York was to me, it's the perfect town if you're starting in stand up. In LA, it's very tough if you're just starting because you're not going to get the prime spots at the, you know, Hollywood clubs, at the Improv, the Comedy Store, and you have to do a lot of open mics. When I started in comedy, there was no such thing as an open mic night. You either passed auditions at the Comic Strip, the Improv, Catch Rising Star, Comedy Store, or you didn't. So once you passed and you did your late night spots, you paid your dues, you hung out, you were guaranteed a really good audience every night. The problem now is it takes, you know, there's so many open mics and you have to go through that where it's almost all comics sitting there, that comics can get sort of beaten down after a while. You need good audiences, you know, you need that too. Is it good to have open mics? Absolutely. You need to have tough crowds too. But you know, you want to know that what you're doing is appreciated. So it's definitely harder now for pretty much every reason you can think of.
And I think anybody working in comedy now, whether you're a booker, whether you're a comedian, a club owner, is doing whatever you can not to beat down the audience
Right.
with guys that haven't been up long enough, even the guys that are introducing everybody, you know, the MCs, because they can tire the audience out before you can even get started. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of things that maybe owning a comedy club now is I think it was different in the 80s where people got educated what has to get done to get those crowds back week after week. And the one thing you can't do is you really have to get the top talent.
Yes. And by the way, you know, and this has been talked about, is the most crucial job on the gig is the MC. You know, people tend sometimes, audience members, to not think of the MC. You know, they'll go up to the MC, say, you know, you were the funniest guy, you should be doing comedy too, as if they weren't doing comedy, because their job is not to tell a lot of jokes. It's to keep the audience up and to bring up the next person right when they get a big laugh. You know, let a big laugh lead into, your job is to make it easy for the next comic to get laughs, not to be the star of the show. And so, you know, I always looked at emceeing as a good opportunity, because I don't have a good memory, to try out jokes, because I can't go on stage and remember like 6 or 7 new jokes to try out at once. But if you're emceeing on a night where there's 10 acts, you can try a new joke each time you go on stage. But you want to keep the show moving along. You're exactly right. You don't want to tire them out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know so I want to go back to that first. How'd you get your first 5-7 minutes?
Okay, so I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I actually, this is how old I am. I auditioned for the Improv in New York for the first time back in 1974.
Wow.
I was way too young to get in the club, but yet I had written some stand-up. And in fact, I stood online with Fred Stoller. You know Fred Stoller?
Sure.
Yeah, but I did it once. And so many comics have had this experience. It's the weirdest thing. First time on stage, I killed. I thought, I'm ready for the big time. And in fact, a personal manager gave me his card. I never called him. I was too afraid. Of course, later on, I thought I should have called him. But anyway, a few weeks later, I came back, did another audition there, and bombed terribly. And for some reason, a lot of comics have that same story.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because we were just too dumb to realize we were not experienced. So we went up there cocky with all this attitude and did well because of that. The first, I don't know, whatever it was, that was I stopped, I went to college, I went to NYU, I studied drama there, but while I was at NYU, I never lost that drive for comedy. So I did all the cabarets. And in fact, it's a pretty incredible class that I graduated in at NYU, because you think about people making their living in comedy, there aren't many. And yet, do you know who Jonathan Schmock and Jim Vallely were, the funny boys?
Of course. Yeah.
So in the same class at NYU, same comedy class we all took, it was me, Schmock and Vallely, Wayne Fetterman, Gary Laser, who I don't know if you know, he was a big act back then. He's been in a few movies, an actor, and Alec Baldwin, all in the same class.
Did the funny boys meet each other there, or did?
Yes, at NYU, I believe.
Wow.
Yep. And I believe they went to the Stella Adler studio. I went to Strasbourg. You could pick your studio then. Yeah.
Wow.
Lately, like I said, there came a certain point when I started writing for TV. I didn't have that drive anymore where I needed to do stand up. I did go back to it eventually. I took about 14 years off while I was writing sort of nonstop for TV, and then I went back to it. But I can remember that feeling of not just wanting to be on stage every night, not needing to be because it was the only way to get better, which is true. That's just, but needing to be, in my soul, needing to be up there every night. And I think you got to have that in you to make it,
Well, there's no way these guys can make it unless that's the only thing that they could possibly do.
That's right. That's right. And, Jerry Seinfeld said it takes him 1 year to write a joke. And it's not because he's going on stage once a year. It's working that joke night in and night out. People don't realize how important word choice is and leaving out words until they study late night monologue, because every word that doesn't need to be in there has to be taken out. And I teach my stand-up students that if it doesn't serve your character or it doesn't serve the joke, there's no reason for that line to be in there. I teach you advanced stand-up class last night. Some comic had a line. I'm originally from Philadelphia. Then I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And my mom, who lives in Santa Fe, well, that first line about where she was from is great if it leads into some biographical joke, but it led into nothing. Then she started talking about her mother. So no, I just said that's information that doesn't need to be in your act because it doesn't serve it would serve your character if it led to what that was like to live in Pennsylvania and now in New Mexico, if you had jokes to follow that with. But if there are no jokes, leave it out. It's got to be cut out, And the difference also is stand-up is written through inspiration. Things have to happen to you in life. Like there was a great old David Brenner joke. You probably remember this. He would always say, "This ever happened to you? This ever happened to you?" He said, "I'm on the subway. I'm sitting on a newspaper, and a woman comes up to me and she says, 'Are you reading that paper?' So I got up, I turned the page, I sat down, I said, 'Yes.'" So my guess is what happened to Brenner, because I know I've experienced that, is he was probably on the subway and a woman said, "Are you reading that paper?" And he probably, this before the voice record, he probably thought, "Oh, this is great. I got to write that down." Because I've heard that. It has to be familiar to us. I always tell comics, we want to know what's unique to you, but let us dip our toes in your world. It can't be a you had to be there thing where you talk about, "Oh, you know how my uncle sounds funny when he coughed?" No, we don't know that. We don't know your uncle. So you have to do something and let us dip our toes in that world. So what Brenner's doing is allowing us to make that experience and then commenting on it in a way that we hadn't thought of, So it's through inspiration. Things have to happen to you. Whereas monologue is the opposite. It has nothing to do with you. Other than Letterman and Ferguson, is almost never in a monologue joke. It's never about your fears, it's none of that. It's not about you. It's about pop culture, politics, sports, whatever it is that you're talking about. It's through perspiration, not inspiration, because half your joke is written already. You're getting setups from the news, right? So you write down all these just basic, simple, factual statements based on a topical news story, and then find a twist on it. And so the easy part of the joke is written, the setup, but there's none of that like things have to happen to me, like sitting on the newspaper. No, you're given an hour every day at the show. You go to your office for an hour and crank out 10 to 20 jokes. I can't do that with stand-up. When something has to happen to me in order for me to think of something. Because if I sit home and just try and write, it's just not going to be as funny as experiencing the minutia of life that nobody's really thought to talk about and then going, "Oh, that's funny. I got to put that down, my voice recorder." I always suggest comics do it in a voice recorder rather than write it, because it's going to be more the way you originally thought of it. We didn't structure it. As soon as it goes from your brain to your hand to the keys, you're structuring it in a more literate way than you would if you were just talking it. And that's the whole, the goal is to be as conversational as possible.
When I was at the Improv all those years, the guys would bring up the little tape recorders. and
Yep.
put it right on the bar stool. Just put it right on there, and
I was
that's
one
what
of
they
the,
were going for. They were
I was
going to
one of them.
record if their joke went over, and what can they do, and how can they change it. It was
You have to. You have to. I mean, now it's so easy. Your phone, you just put your voice recorder on, and you should be recording every single set because that's the only way you can do what Seinfeld's talking about and try it 100 different ways with 100 different audiences. See which way it works best. The only because you'll never remember exactly. What if you're doing a joke and it's not getting a laugh, and one night you say it a little bit differently and it murders, it just kills. Well, if you didn't tape your set, I guarantee you're not going to remember the way you said that joke. So yeah, you should be recording every set. And it's torture. It's torture listening to ourselves. Watching ourselves is even worse, but it's a necessary part of the process.
well. I hope people at home right now realize that we're getting a BOGO here today. We're getting Gabe, and we're getting Gabe, the incredibly experienced and knowledgeable teacher on stand up and writing for television. So I really appreciate it, and I know everybody else is appreciating it. And you know what? People need to hear this. People need to hear more of it. And I'd like you to tell me, can people access what you do from anywhere in the country, or do they have to be in LA?
Anywhere in the country, ever since the pandemic, every single class at Flappers has been selling out because anyone in the world can take it now. So I have people where it's really tough for them to take it because of their time zone, it might be the middle of the night, but it's great because anybody can take it from around the country now, and the problem is there are too many teachers of stand-up out there that really should not be teaching, that never made their living doing stand-up. Unless you've been in that situation, there are also teachers in New York and LA that say they wrote for late night, that wrote for Jay Leno or Letterman for 15 years. But a lot of them, if all the student, and I would always recommend this, go to IMDb, the international database, and go to whatever show they said they write for, because they list hundreds of writers over the last 50, 60 years for The Tonight Show. If that instructor's name is not on that list, that means they faxed jokes. They were not on staff. And if you're not on staff, you cannot teach students what the day in, day like routine is like, and not just what to do, what not to do, the red flags, because it's not just about getting the job, because you only work in 13-week cycles and late night. You got to be renewed every 13 weeks. And I saw writers come and go all the time at Letterman, like a revolving door. So it's not just getting the job, it's keeping the job. And there's all sorts of politics and socializing that's involved. And again, you have to have been through that. So what I really pass on is not through some special God-given knowledge. It's just through 41 years of doing this and 25 years in late night, and working across many different shows to teach them not just the process, not just what to do, but what not to do.
Yeah, exactly. You're not the first person that's come on that's taught. Listen, you might be able to find your way into show business, but you better know what not to do, or else you're going to cut yourself off at the knees, and you'll be on the out list from that point on.
Yeah, I have people that come to me. There's something called the NBC Late Night Writers Workshop, and they take younger writers and basically develop them for late night. It's like a workshop thing. And I've had so many people come to me and then take a private session from me and say, "Oh my God, I wish I had come to you before it." They don't get the gig, they don't get the writers workshop. And then I explain, well, look, in your packet you had a joke about like Alex Trebek dying. Somebody wrote a joke on that. Not about him dying, but about him. Well, he's one of the most beloved television personalities. You don't put that in a packet. You don't put, if you're going for a network show, I say, this is what I tell my students: to stay away from first date subjects: death, disease, race, religion, and sexual orientation. Once you've got the job, submit any joke on that. The worst is they don't do it, but never have your packet rejected due to content. Only because it's not funny enough, because that's sort of out of your control, the level of funny, so to speak. But the choice, the subject matter, that's a choice that you can make. So never have your packet rejected because something's a red flag. Well, we would never make a joke about Black Lives Matter, whatever. Pack it in the garbage. You have to know what to stay away from. And you also have to know, this is something that nobody teaches you, that a monologue joke should be 3 lines or less on the page. That doesn't mean that when Fallon or Kimmel tells it, they're not going to stretch it into a 30-second story, but they want to see it short on the page. So there's all these unwritten rules, that I teach that will help them get the gig.
So how exactly can they find you for that?
Okay, well, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter at Gabelson, Gabelson, hashtag Gabelson, Gabelson. And they can hit me up on Facebook, Gabe Abelson. And then my business email is Gabe, G-A-B-E Abelson, A-B-E-L-S-O-N @gmail.com. I teach the flappers classes and the private classes, which are ridiculously reasonable.
Well, you're going to be busier now than you've ever been, because there's one thing that I know, and I'm going to be working with comedians, and I'm going to be putting together some 80s golden age of comedy tours and concerts, comedy concerts. And perhaps we could talk a little bit about that after the show. But before, how does someone be the kind of funny to get a job writing for such big people like you have?
Well, it's interesting. In '94, when Bill Maher's show was on Comedy Central, his original show, Politically Incorrect, I got hired to do the warm-up, which is the toughest job in stand-up, as you know. It's really hard, especially at Politically Incorrect, where they're arguing behind you in the commercial break and you have to stand there and talk to the crowd. They want to hear the political argument that's going on, So I did the show, and I don't know why it never occurred to me, because I grew up with Johnny Carson and David Letterman. I watched Maher's monologue, and I said to the head writer and executive producer, both of whom were comics, Scott Carter and Billy Martin, both comics from the 80s. And I said, if I have a joke for Bill, what do I do? Do I tell you if I have an idea for a joke? Tell Bill? They said, well, we have a fax team, $50 a joke. It was less than Letterman at the time, but it was non-union at the time. And I eventually ended up joining the show when it was union on ABC when they moved out to LA. That's what got me out to LA years later after the Letterman job. So the first night I tried this, I faxed jokes to the show because I forgot the timing of it, but I guess I faxed early in the morning before I came to do warm-up, because I was just a warm-up guy. I wasn't a writer. So I faxed jokes the very first night. Bill only did 6 jokes. The first night, 3 of the 6 were mine. Half the monologue was mine. And then watching on TV was more exciting than anything that had happened in my 14 years of stand-up.
Wow.
The validation, like, oh my God, I didn't know I could do this. And so I'm like, I can do this. And then the next night I had nothing on and I was ready to retire. It was like, oh God, okay, I got really lucky. But then the next night I had 1, then again I had 3. And after a few weeks, they called me up. They said, we want to put you on retainer, meaning we'll give you like 400 a week to send 10 or 20 a day. You've proved your value, how valuable you are, but we're not giving you a staff job because you've never worked in TV. They didn't say that, but I had no TV experience. So I loved it. Now I was getting a guaranteed amount of money. It was the mid-90s. The money had already dipped in stand-up. So now I had this thing to do during the day, which was write monologue jokes. I do my warm-up for the show, and I didn't think anything about it. I never really had a career plan. They move out to LA. They cut the fax program. I happened to be doing a one-nighter with Adrienne Tolsch, one of the greatest comics of the 80s. And she was married to Bill Sheft, who was the head writer at Letterman, both of whom I knew from stand-up. And I said to Adrienne, I was writing for Maher. He left. Do you think Letterman might be interested? I happen to have my joke packet on me. She said, these are great. Send them to Bill. I'm not making any promises. Bill said, these jokes are great. We have a fax team. 75 a joke was a little more. Exact same thing happened. Got a lot of jokes on. He put me on retainer, which was more because it was union. I think it was 600 a week. I was thrilled, but I knew there was no room at Letterman because it was just Bill Sheft. And so I should have, but I didn't make plans to send packets to other shows. I was just happy doing stand-up at night, getting my 600 a week and doing that during the day. One day out of the blue, Bill Sheft calls me up and says, I'm leaving the show to write a book. Would you be interested in my job?
Wow.
No, I've been on the road for 17 years working the Chuckle Hut in St. Louis. I don't want to be head monologue writer for the most respected talk show on TV.
Wow.
So needless to say, I said yes. And there were 5 retainer guys. We all interviewed for the job, but I was the only stand-up. And I think that's what got me the gig. I think Dave wanted someone
And
that knew what it was like.
someone I've known for 40 years is Bob Perlow over who, as you know, worked for Jay for all of his warm-ups. He was
Mhm.
someone I'm still in touch with, and funny, funny, funny guy. Tough job, and he made it a professional.
He is a great, yeah, that, it's like emceeing at a club except to the 100th degree. Because you're really not there to do any material, and you have to be lightning fast. The best crowd work that I've ever seen was Jimmy Brogan. I've never seen anybody as quick on their feet talking to the audience and as good an MC as Jimmy was. He would talk to 1/3 of the room, and then he would talk to the middle section. It was almost scientific. And then he would do a callback to something he had said to the first group. Then he would work the other third, the last third, and he would have a callback to the second one and to the first one. It was like, how is he doing this on his feet? It was like watching the greatest magician. He was just so good at it. Yeah.
Wow, what an incredible career. Um, when you're destined to be in a business and you take it seriously, you got yourself. I mean, I can't imagine you working with better people than you work with Letterman and Marr. And how long were you with the Tonight Show with Jay?
I was with the Tonight Show only about a year and a half. I was with Letterman for 5 years, which is a lifetime at that show. I could tell you some household names that came and went on that show. Again, it's you just never know. Writers always go through their first 13-week cycle sweating it out, hoping they'll get renewed, and they have to let you know in your 9th week. So usually if you don't get renewed, nobody has to come back for those other weeks. And so you get through your first cycle and you get renewed, you relax a little bit, but you still know that date on the calendar when your next one's going to expire. Once you get through 2 or 3 cycles, you know that they like you and you're there.
And you know that you were liked because you were up for 5 Emmy Awards.
Yes, and 3 or 4 Writers Guild Awards also, which means a lot because that's our peers as well voting for that. It was a very different skill, but things happened for me within a very short period of time of even attempting late night writing. Within 2 years, I went from nothing, from never having done it, to head monologue writer at Letterman, whereas I'd been doing stand-up at that point when I got Letterman for 16, 17 years.
Wow.
So I had to admit to myself, holy crap, here's a skill I didn't even know I have that's better than the skill I thought I was destined for when I was 13. Now, I still, I got to the point, obviously, where I was headlining stand-up clubs and so forth, but I never reached that next level. But in late night, I got as far as you can go, and so I realized this is, again, my brain is wired in such a way that writing for late night comes really easy to me because there are formulas and structures to jokes. And I can break down a monologue joke for you if you want. Can I break down a joke?
Yeah, sure.
This is how technical it is and how it's written. So I just think this joke is sort of a good example of how it works. So when I was at Letterman through parts of both Clinton's administration and parts of Bush's first administration. And when Clinton got caught with Monica, that was gold for the late night comics. They now since have expressed regret for you making her the punchline, but back then it was open season. And so we closed with a Monica sex joke every night. And the reason was it's CBS. And we knew the sex joke was all about the act that happened in the Oval Office and that it was going to get the biggest laugh because it's so forbidden to tell a dirty joke on CBS. So we wouldn't say BJ, but everybody knew what we were getting at. So every night was a Monica joke. So this is right after the scandal that broke with Clinton. About 2 months or so after the scandal, there was an item in the paper that Clinton had hired 2 spiritual advisors to come and pray with him in the White House. And I thought, well, this is a typical empty politician's gesture. There's got to be a joke here. So the joke was President Clinton hired 2 spiritual advisors to come and pray with him every week. Just what we need, more people in the Oval Office on their knees. So everybody knows what's going on. They feel smart for putting it together, which is a big, big key in comedy, is walking that tightrope between not giving them too much information, making them feel stupid and killing your own joke, and not giving them enough information where it's, like I said, you had to be there. So there, everybody knows what's going on. So how does that joke get written? The joke gets written, I see Clinton's spiritual advisors. I know as soon as I see Clinton where I want to end up, with Monica giving him that in the Oval Office. Now I got to figure out, what can I tie into that? The other, my friend Joe Toplin, who wrote a book called Writing for Late Night TV, we call them handles. And the one handle is the Monica Sex Act. The other one is a spiritual advisor. So where do they tie in? Now I go through a mental word association, like a Rolodex. Spiritual advisors, what did they do? They wear robes. Maybe there's a tie-in with Monica's blue dress and the stain. No, the wine, the wafer, no. They pray on their knees. That's when the light bulb lights up over your head. That's where you found the two subjects intersecting. So 95% of monologue jokes are two or more completely separate ideas tied together in a funny and unexpected way. And you see, that's a definition. I can't define a stand-up joke. It's far more open. And you take that punchline, just what they need, more people in the Oval Office on their knees. I remember the original way I wrote it is just what they need, more people on their knees in the Oval Office. Would still get a laugh, but guess what? It's funnier if knees comes last, because knees is the punch word. So if I say on their knees in the Oval Office, I'm going past the punchline, which is anticlimactic, past the punch word. That, it's a very, very technical application where stand-up shouldn't be formulaic or you're a hack. Monologue has to be formulaic. There's a reason you hear the same cadence, Jimmy Fallon going da 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 da, or as we call it, blank, da 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 da, apparently, da 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 da. There's a very set structure, and it's learning the rhythm, learning the musicality, just like learning how many beats per measure, there's a language to it. So if you're a comic and set up punchline, it's like knowing French and learning German. A lot of the words are going to be similar, slightly different, but you'll know what a lot of them mean, but there's going to be a whole ton of words that you've never heard before. So just because you're a stand-up, this is still a new language to learn.
Wow, how incredibly helpful is this to be able to, for anyone who wants to be a stand-up, anybody who wants to be a writer is getting like gold from you here. This is really incredible. So the last thing that I just wanted to ask is, let's throw 2020 out. Just throw it out. Are you a stand-up guy from this point on? Are you done? Do you still love it? Can you still see yourself going out and getting some good gigs?
I do. I do. Before the world shut down, yeah, I was traveling. I was doing a lot of gigs. I also do, I can't even get into that today, but I do a mentalism act, a persuasion suggestion act. It's not hypnosis, but it's very different. And there's a lot of comedy in it. That was something I've done as a hobby for a number of years. And I started doing that professionally about 8 years ago. So sometimes if I go on the road, I'll do a full straight stand-up set and then a mentalism set as well. So yes, I still do it. And I still write for shows. I was writing for a show, for a sports talk show on Fubo TV last year. I work a lot with Tom Green. I was the head writer on his show. And we've had these, one of my absolute closest friends in the world. And so whenever he does a talk show, I usually am on staff there. And I still have a relationship with Jay. He and I talk all the time, and I do some work with him. So yes, it's still there. But my biggest passion now really is teaching, is passing this on. Like I said, I mean, it's interesting how you're driven to do different things at different times. And the way I feel about teaching now is the way I felt about stand-up for many, many years. That, I love the week to week, seeing people get it more and more, and their monologue jokes getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So when I send them out there, I know they're going to know everything to do, everything not to do, and they're in a good position to get the gig.
Wow. Well, what incredible information. I am thrilled that you said you'd come on the show, and this couldn't have been any more interesting and exciting. And I know we're going to be in contact with each other because I've got these things going on that I want to talk with you more about. So thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you,
For being
Bruce. It was
on
a lot
the
of fun.
80s golden age of comedy. You're listening to this and watching the 80s golden age of comedy.com. Make sure you go there and check out all of the video recordings, all the broadcasts from before. So bye-bye, everybody.